Welcome to the video of the second session of our Fractures series. It was a brilliant session, but due to a technical problem, we were unable to record the webinar. Fortunately, we caught up with the speakers after the event and re-recorded their remarks, which we've pulled together here. So the session examined some really important questions that we're all grappling with right now as genocide continues to unfold in Gaza, war breaks out with Iran, and nations seem increasingly uncommitted to any form of international law or accountability. We wanted to know, what was the promise and reality of the liberal order? Did it deserve to die? What is the future for international law and multilateralism? What will replace it? And what should we demand in its place? And we have some brilliant people to start answering these questions. The first is Asli Bâli, who is a professor of law at Yale Law School and the president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. She's an editor of the American Journal of International Law, co-chair of the MENA Division of Human Rights Watch, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. The second is Shahd Hammouri, a Jordanian Palestinian academic and international lawyer. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Corporate War, Profiteering and International Law, and is a senior legal advisor at law for Palestine and a non-resident fellow at Hague for Applied International Law. Jomo Kwame Sundaram was an economics professor until 2004 and Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations system from 2005 until 2015. He's received the 2007 Wassily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought, several honorary doctorates, and the 2026 World Academy of Sciences Award in Social Sciences. So I first turn to Asli to ask about the international order constructed after the Second World War. We see increasing challenges to what has been dubbed a liberal international order, whether it is the United States sanctioning the International Criminal Court or the complete impunity of nations like Israel with the genocide in Gaza. Should we be mourning its loss? Asli traced its history to explain how the system's structural flaws led to this moment and what is different now to the 1990s when the system perhaps lay at the peak of its legitimacy.
So the question that was posed to me is whether we're seeing irredeemable structural flaws in the institutional architecture underpinning public international law as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza, the many crises that we're experiencing globally. And I think it's important to understand the degree to which, instead of presenting these as structural flaws, we should understand them as the features of the institutional architecture of the international legal order from the beginning. The design of the post-World War II international order was one that deliberately internalized asymmetries and built in exceptions, which are now being exhibited. So, for example, the decision to build the architecture of the security order around exemptions for the most powerful states at the end of the Second World War by according them veto powers, which enable them to block any coordinated international action in the realm of international peace and security on the basis of their own discretionary determinations of their national security interests. That is a structural feature of the international legal order. So the veto, the asymmetry built into the Security Council, was a decision to design an architecture in which the most powerful states were given the ability to block international action wherever their interests were implicated by their own unilateral determination. That is a feature of the architecture of the international legal order. Now, it was designed this way in order to keep those major powers within the system rather than have them potentially defect from the system as they had done in the international legal order that was designed at the end of the First World War. So these asymmetries were built in for a reason, but it is those asymmetries today that are playing out. And of course, the structure, which presumed the distribution of power that existed at the end of the Second World War, now is overlaid on an increasingly changing distribution of power in the international system. It's important to understand that this is a feature of the international legal order because sometimes, particularly generations that were not present at the design at the end of the Second World War, that did not live under the sense of existential fear of global nuclear conflagration, that a third world war was imminent, have a difficult time understanding the logic of this architecture and are also confused by the legacy of the 1990s, a time when, in the post-Cold War period, there seemed to be broad international cooperation around humanitarian commitments. And so people reread the history of the 1990s as a history of humanitarian intervention, of the defense of human rights, of intervening in places where civilian populations were put at risk, and so forth. That's a fundamental misunderstanding on my own reading of what happened in the 1990s. Instead, it's best understood as a time when the underlying distribution of power was shifting, particularly away from what had been the Soviet Union and what became Russia, in favor of the United States. And the United States used that moment of quasi-unipolarity in order to exert its preferences. And so it intervened wherever it was relevant to its own interest. For example, it chose to intervene belatedly in the context of the Bosnia conflict because of increasing destabilization and migration flows in the continent of Europe, because it wanted to secure Europe. By contrast, in the same period, there was no intervention in the increasingly violent wars that were taking place in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And that was not because there was an impediment to intervention, that vetoes were being asserted, but rather because there was simply no political will. There has always been a system of purely elective use of human rights or humanitarianism as a register to defend civilian populations anywhere. And if they happen to be in a place that's deemed geostrategically significant, they may indeed experience either intervention in their favor or against the civilian population. And if they're in areas that are deemed geostrategically insignificant, then it's very likely that you might have hundreds of thousands, even millions killed without any meaningful intervention. And indeed, conflict in the Great Lakes region of Africa continues to this day, having consumed at this time hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives without anyone making arguments about humanitarian intervention. So to understand this, it's important to know that in the 1990s, the doctrines of humanitarian intervention were simply doctrines that gave license for a kind of geopolitical gamesmanship in which intervention would occur because of geostrategic interest and intervention would fail because of the lack of political will. There's no rupture from that system in my own view today. We still see the colonial logics of the design of the international legal order, which from the outset sought to exempt colonial action from humanitarian scrutiny. So, for example, the original versions of the Genocide Convention were not understood to be applicable in the colonial holdings of Europe at that time. Similarly, international humanitarian law was rife with exemptions in circumstances in which colonial powers were acting in what they deemed to be their colonial territories. And structural racism has been baked into the international legal order from the beginning. It endorses a distribution of power that itself is an artifact of colonialism, slavery, extractive and exterminationist policies in the colonial period towards the rest of the world. So even as you saw decolonization ushered in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, under this international legal order, the underlying presumptions were to legitimize the distributions of wealth and power that were produced through colonialism. What's different in this moment is less the nature of the international legal order, which persists with all the structural features I described, the asymmetries, the geopolitical license, the indifference to humanitarianism, the elective determinations of which conflicts are worthy of being negotiated or stopped and which are not, and those that are allowed to persist or even grow. What's different, rather, is that the United States, in many respects, is not only no longer a unipolar power, so we're definitely past the Cold War and past the post-Cold War in its initial formation. We're in a new era where there's a broader distribution of power, where even a power like Russia has been able to reassert itself, where significant distributions of power have shifted to China, to the global south, elsewhere. But also the United States is increasingly the actor most likely to defect from rules of its own authorship, even though it benefits from asymmetric advantages, even though the system was designed by the US in order to ensure and project its own power and hegemony. It is the US itself that is defecting. And this is in part because the United States, as a consequence of a record of its own conduct and its own foreign policy, and the degree to which those policies have been destabilizing globally, has lost the capacity to command consent globally without coercion. In other words, where it once was able to declare coalitions of the willing to support its own foreign policy objectives when it determined that it was going to intervene militarily in different parts of the world, Today, it is not able to command the consent necessary to get coalitions together to support its foreign policy preferences, and instead has to exert coercion. At the moment, it might take the form of tariffs, it might take the form of blustering threats, etc. Tomorrow, it might take the form of outright military incursions, as we've seen the US, for example, assert new territorial ambitions against sovereign territories without any apparent limit to the kinds of policies it might resort to in order to achieve those ambitions. So, to the extent that we may be living through a fracture, that fracture is being driven by the conduct of the United States, which is inconsistent with its earlier history in the post-World War II period, partly because, as I say, it's lost its capacity to command consent, and partly because we're seeing a redistribution of power in a way that's adverse to the United States.
Shahd then brought home how these structural injustices in the so-called liberal international order had been so rawly exposed by the genocide in Gaza.
So the post-war world order, as we call it, with that came with the establishment of the United Nations, sought to kind of create a clean slate of what would be the new rules of the game, so to speak. And those rules of the game were really built on the notion of colonial erasure. It is not that the United Nations started with recognizing that most of the world was under European colonization and being exploited to its core, with European corporations taking hold of the world. And in reality, that whole premises then came to normalize the supremacy, so to speak, of some powers over other powers. So it was very normal within that system to normalize the exploitation of the Congo, civil wars, intervention by states, the race to the bottom, and all of that. So it is as if these things, the tolerance, so to speak, to these forms of atrocities, exploitation, domination, and subjugation were really written into the system. However, because it is a legal system and because it kind of tried to translate what we know as the European legal system, Western legal thought understood more broadly, which of course in its own turn is very sympathetic to capitalism and everything within that, it still had to uphold this facade, so to speak, of a claim to justice, and to be somewhat legitimized in front of the rest of the world, especially the quote unquote uncivilized world that sought to come into the civilized legal system by claiming that it does serve justice on some level or the other. This is what I call the insecurity of international law, whereby it represents itself under a veneer of justice, but in reality is very malleable to the interests of capital and power. So, but what happened with Gaza is that whole dynamic was put on the stage. The fact that some lives are worth more than others, the fact that the world order needs to remain as it is indeed there at the forefront and at the stage with Gaza. So here we're faced with very different understandings of what international law is meant to do. For some people, international law is meant to serve this premises for equality and, under its veneer, build on a world where we're all seen as human beings. But its reality is that it is in service of that power. And we find that tension really in our study of international law. So, mainstream liberal international lawyers would rather uphold the status quo and understand international peace and security as upholding the status quo at whichever cost. And in reality, this is just the very bloody manifestation of what otherwise would have been spoken in very nice words in international law conferences, wearing suits and saying that this is absolutely fine and we should tolerate this as human beings because this is the best option that we have.
Shahd also shared the experience of what it was like practically as an international lawyer to fight for justice for Palestine within the current system.
On the 23rd of October 2023, a group of Palestinian representatives went to the UN Human Rights Commissioner, and we were all dressed in black, shocked. It was around the time of the Mahmadani hospital massacre. It was the first semblance of what will then become a long series of targeting of hospitals and patients. And we entered the office of the UN Human Rights Commissioner. We were greeted with smiles. and asked to come into this room overlooking the beautiful mountains of Geneva. We sat down and we explained that without anchoring our analysis of the situation as a classic case of settler colonization that often does come with genocide as premised on the history of colonization as a whole, also adding to that the very factual evidence of the statements of Israeli officials, the level of the use of armaments, and all the different forms of evidence that lead to the very solid conclusion that over 800 scholars and international lawyers signed on at the time, noting that a genocide will happen in Gaza. We were met with a long silence that was then met with the question of, okay, what now? And what is your plan for the day after? So we were met with the whole liberal establishment accepting the risk, accepting the atrocity, and seeking to simply navigate it in humanitarian terms, rather than sounding the alarm and accepting our distress. In reality, what has happened ever since then is a long bureaucratic process of you're being mass murdered, please wait in line. At moments when we saw the most horrendous acts of humanity, of the largest cohort of amputated children in the whole world, over 15,000 children killed, let alone all the families devastated, let alone also the over 10,000 Palestinian prisoners under torture, and all of that horrendousness. And still, in the United Nations, we were asked over and over again to go through the bureaucratic procedures. And then we were always met with the most convoluted forms of language. Plausible genocide. It is conditions that might be calculated to bring about the destruction of a group. It was exactly the same aura that the BBC deals with the deaths of Palestinians, as if this death it has to happen. And here again, we see the manifestation of this international legal order that is premised on colonial erasure and the normalization of the humanization of some people. Palestinians can only be victims, and response to them can only be humanitarian. So to speak of words such as liberation and to speak of words that capture the settler colonial context here is completely foreign to the practitioners within that field. And what we said and the language that we were using was considered too emotional, perhaps, or unprofessional, or not fitting, because of course us too would have easily been the subjects of these bombs, and our lives would have been equally seen to be worthless. Nevertheless, over the generations, Palestinian scholars, as well as ally scholars from all across the Arab region, as well as the global South and the global North, have sought to strategically use international law. So, again, going back to the personal story, as a young person who was born around the Second Intifada, I was myself quite moved at the time by my mother telling me that there are children. I grew up in Jordan, so very close by, who were just like yourself, were being killed. And that urge in me led me to end up becoming an international lawyer. And there are hundreds of people, if not over thousands, who had the same appeal. We were told that there is the system that serves some semblance of justice, and if you want to defend your people, then you need to have a voice. But then, once we arrived in these spaces, what we found was that these places were not indeed designed for us.
We also asked Jomo, who has long pushed for the right of nations in the global south to equitable development, how the system had worked for low and middle income countries.
What we have now is a world where the rules are very uncertain. The style of the American president is perhaps unique in the sense that he is not really thinking about the medium term, and he thinks primarily in terms of transactions and negotiations. But in international relations, this was preceded by the whole idea of game theory, where you're always trying to win the game. Unfortunately, all these approaches, whether the old approach or the new approach, do not prioritize creating the conditions for sustained peace. Especially from the perspective of the global south, it is extremely important to create the conditions for sustained peace and also for progress and development. The Global South is particularly disadvantaged by the current approach adopted by the larger powers in the world. Even in Europe, for example, which one hoped would be more independent of Washington, there have been pressures, particularly from the right, to prioritize what are considered to be national interests. There is a tendency also to blame the other, to blame the outsider, whether it is immigrant labor or workers who are producing goods more cheaply than in Europe or in the West. At the same time, we find that the Global South is not united, and organizationally, there is very little leadership of the Global South. And this puts the Global South at a huge disadvantage. And some of the poorest countries are the worst off. We have seen over the last decade the attitudes towards the poorest countries has turned from what might be termed a charitable approach to a much more aggressive approach, that they deserve what they have and so on. The Trump administration's view is particularly challenging. What we see is an assault on everybody in the world. But of course, everybody is not being treated equally, and everybody is not able to respond with the same capacities. And so we find, for example, that there is very little emphasis on some of the conditions of the past, of sustaining economic growth, of sustaining development, of improving the conditions for humankind. All these things have been cast aside in favor of new priorities. It is not only the United States which wants the rest of the world to pay for the military umbrella which it claims to provide for the rest of the world, Europe as well as the Global South. But we find that in Europe, there is a turn towards what some people used to call military Keynesianism, to sustain economic growth through spending on the military, whereas factories which were previously producing cars or trucks, for instance, are now producing tanks and so on. So we have a redeployment, and it is very unlikely that this new strategy adopted in different parts of the world, especially in Europe, will be able to sustain growth. And so the conditions for most people in the world will likely continue to deteriorate, not only because of the economic stagnation which is coming about due to this kind of very unproductive nationalism, but also because of the inability to provide an alternative and the inability of anybody to provide an alternative leadership. So we will find that the Global South is being left to fend for itself, and the vast majority in the Global South are looking elsewhere. And in a sense, the West has turned its back on the South.
Shahd and Aslı both spoke to the experience of the decolonization movements of the 1960s and the questions they asked about what a decolonized international order could look like.
Another reading of international law can really be traced back to the 1950s and 60s, where, as Alvarez would say, a new international order was brewing with the decolonization, or not, we can't really actually call it decolonization as much as formal independence, so to speak, and the new age of neocolonialism coming to the fore in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And what Alvarez was trying to say, for example, in the Anglo-Iranian oil case at the International Court of Justice, was that, well, if we are really serious about decolonization, then we should reimagine international law. It should not simply be a mirror of Western legal thought. It should just not simply be an understanding of international peace and security as the status quo. We should understand interdependence, histories of colonization, and we should recognize that within the rules. And then there was a series of resolutions that sought to take this forward. So, for example, the Declaration on Friendly Relations, the Declaration on Ending All Forms of Colonization, the New International Economic Order, they all sought to establish premises that try to evade very strict understanding of private property, for example, in Western legal thought. They were saying, actually, sovereignty over natural resources is more important than acquired rights by colonial corporations. They're trying to say that non non-intervention is a primary principle to ascertain sovereignty, and states should not intervene in the internal politics of states of the global south that, of course, were under, at the time, consistent coups d'etats by imperial powers. So in this case, in this case, there was this very interesting, different reading of a new world order, so to speak, of international law. However, sadly, with Thatcher and Reagan coming to the fora in the 1980s, that project was killed, and international law was back on its status quo liberal framework. So here we find that actually it worked as it would have been expected. And critical lawyers were usually seen to be on the margins of the discipline, were suddenly pushed towards the front in the sense that their warning of the workings of politics and colonial erasure in the deceiving and distorting nature of international law really came to light. And it is also very manifest in the fact that so many international lawyers were hesitant and still are hesitant to call things by their name, to condemn things, and are still capable of using very dehumanizing language and accepting of the fact that their own terminologies and works could be used to normalize one of the worst atrocities we have seen in the history of mankind.
True decolonization would require a redistribution of power that, in my view, is beyond what the current international system as presently constituted can yield. So first, let's understand what decolonization was as it occurred in the mid-20th century. It was, amongst other things, the actual culmination of the colonial logic of the previous centuries. So decolonization proceeded in a way in which states were required to assume the political, legal, and institutional forms of the European nation state, essentially, in order to be accorded freedom, in order to be accorded autonomy and sovereignty. So it generalized, the process of decolonization generalized the inbuilt injustices of the European state system across a world that was heterogeneous, that was not organized in racial or religious terms, that did not previously have political orders that required that the governing structure define a majoritarian ethnicity or religion to define the nation, but were instead, various forms of rule and political organization that were not defined along those terms. We lost that, and we introduced this global system that conjoins this idea of nation, that is a community defined in identitarian terms, to the state, the so-called nation state, which says that the organizing political institutions have to be attached to some identitarian conception of the polity itself and of the peoples of that polity. What this unleashed was logic of racialized inclusion and exclusion globally. So each of those newly autonomous decolonized states not only did not receive any form of reparation or restitution for the expropriation, extermination, and enslavement that had preceded their autonomy. So they had been immiserated, impoverished, their populations had been subjected to brutal force, and they received no compensation for any of this and were declared suddenly autonomous and solely responsible for the future, which involved reconstructing some kind of a functional polity out of the detritus of the damage that had been wrought by colonialism without any access to resources or means after all the resources had been depleted through colonial extraction. Those were the terms of decolonization. And on top of that, the states were required to organize themselves along the lines of European statehood, introducing a logic of permanent insiders, permanent majorities, and permanent minorities within the borders of every state in the world. And this logic, as it was grafted onto deeply heterogeneous parts of the world, meant that you had the potential for, again, gross ethnic, religious, racial violence being unleashed globally, which were the dynamics that produced the European state system in the first place. It's worth remembering that the European state system itself is the consequence of centuries of bloody violence on the continent of Europe in the name of race and religion, which came to an uneasy truce after, again, that centuries of violence produced the homogenization of different territories and the imposition of a single language, a single cultural identity on geographies that were once extremely diverse. So that same racialized logic of violence was introduced globally, and that's what we call decolonization. So if we understand that earlier decolonization properly, it is a process of globalizing racial logics that originate in Europe, while at the same time offering no reparation or redistribution to correct for the massive transfers of wealth out of the global south and to the global north through theft, exploitation, expropriation, and extermination for the prior centuries. A process of true decolonization, which is what I was asked about, would need to begin from fundamentally different premises. It would have to abandon the idea of the sovereign right to exclude identities, persons, the free flow of people across borders, all of which was the global presumption prior to colonization. Indeed, the largest mass migration of humans known to date is the mass migration of Europeans across the rest of the world in the midst of colonialism and extraction. So returning to a model that does not begin from the sovereign right to exclude, in which rights and responsibilities are not premised on a state-based order, but rather they are based in the equal rights of human beings to flourish, to travel, to be able to benefit from the resources that collectively are available to us as humanity. All of the current structural features of the existing international legal order and its state system impede any model of true decolonization. Still, we can only begin from where we are. So it is not possible for us to step outside of the existential circumstance we all find ourselves in, step outside of history and return to some earlier moment or some earlier condition that is not defined by the historical processes that produced racism, colonialism, enslavement, extraction, expropriation, extermination. Instead, we can only begin from within the existing multilateral institutions, understanding them as sites of domination, yes, but also sites of struggle, sites of resistance, places where you can begin to imagine how to remake from within. There are many examples of this in which the Global South has offered master classes in diplomacy and how to use these existing institutions to achieve more emancipatory ends, while also never letting go of the possibility of redesigning the system itself from without. And so examples of how the struggle has been advanced through existing multilateral institutions includes, for example, the negotiation of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which itself was driven by the states of the Global South and which enshrined the idea that it is an absolute peremptory norm to prohibit racial discrimination as an organizing political logic. That's a remarkable achievement on the heels of centuries in which that was precisely the organizing basis for almost all of political institutional life. Now it's absolutely prohibited and it's considered a jus cogens norm. That's a remarkable achievement. The UN Human Rights Council is a space in which you see the Global South assert itself, resisting narratives of human rights that authorize new forms of colonial intervention and advancing alternative visions, including, as we've seen, in the context of the Gaza conflict, in which you have repeated majorities assert themselves, both in the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly, defining the conflict for what it is, genocidal violence, decrying Israeli rule for what it is over Palestinians in the occupied territories as apartheid, and indeed also the condition of the Palestinian citizens within the 48 territories, and using a variety of institutions, from the ones I've already named to the International Court of Justice and beyond, to rehearse publicly in the broadest possible, to the broadest possible world audiences, the argument and the logic precisely of why all of this must be resisted from within the existing institutions. Now, all of this is also evidence of why the existing institutions require reform, as I already suggested in the answer to the previous question. But it's also possible to imagine reconstruction from within through deconstructive critiques, but also through advancing new emancipatory projects from within existing multilateral institutions, starting from where we are, while simultaneously entertaining projects for imagining better and alternative designs going forward.
The discussion ended with reflections from all the panelists on how to navigate a flawed international order in this time of fractures and great power competition.
After what Trump has done to the rest of the West, mainly to Europe, it is possible that Europe will be forced to review its options and to reconsider its foreign policy. The former High Representative of the European Commission, Mr. Josep Borrell, for example, very famously described Europe as a garden and how Europe must go out of the garden to protect the European garden by going into the global south. Now, perhaps we will see there is a possibility of a change in stance, that Europe begins to realize that in many ways its own future and well-being lies in cooperating with the rest of the world, especially with the global south. But it remains to be seen. There is very little evidence of such leadership coming about in the near future. Since the old days of the 20th century, and perhaps the late Nelson Mandela was the last of the towering figures of global south who could provide that kind of moral leadership. There are no more such figures. Perhaps Lula may be the last one. And so we do not have that kind of broad leadership of the global south coming from within the global south. So it is not just Europe which seems to be leaderless, but it is the global south also. And it is precisely for this reason that perhaps the White House feels that it will be able to impose its will on the rest of the world. The most important thing is realism. Let us recognize that these are very dark times. We need to build new alliances. We need to build broad alliances. We need to have inclusive alliances because that's all we have, the strength of the people. It is not only those in the global south, but everybody will have to re-examine their condition and be willing to be open to building new coalitions going forward. It's very difficult to have a shared view of progress because different people have different views of progress, but let us say we can agree on that, and minimally, because the threat is so great, peace. Peace with ourselves, and as the late Pope Francis would say, peace with nature.
Now, there are many, many risks in this moment. Much can be lost with the loss of the stabilizing force, for better or worse, that even a deeply racist and deeply troubling, fundamentally colonial international legal order provided. For example, we witnessed a near nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan just last month, which has enormous risk and continues to be a destabilizing factor in South Asia. And we are currently witnessing an Israeli attack on Iran that has similar potential to become nuclearized. So there are very, very serious risks associated with and losses associated with the destabilization of that international legal order. But on the other hand, there are also opportunities, including opportunities for the global south to assert demands that may yet produce a further redistribution of the global balance of power in ways that could be actually less unstable, less war prone, as the United States capacity unilaterally to assert power and command consent declines, and as other powers that may be less warlike, emerge and rise. So we are certainly in a moment of transition. It's not at all clear to me that this is a fracture. The things that people are most critical of that we're witnessing, things like the Ukraine war and the Gaza conflict, are evidence of continuity rather than rupture with the earlier system. But I do think there are other places where we see significant fractures, notably the conduct of the United States. And I think there are both potentially positive and very, very negative consequences that might flow from that.
They are built for us to approve our humanity over and over and over again until that eats up a part of our own souls. And nevertheless, now we have a group of people, and not just working on Palestine, working on the whole of the global south, as, let's say, can be like the example of this could be third world approaches to international law as a movement, and critical scholars who are seeking to discursively engage with international law. So this is what Noor Ariqat calls principled pragmatism, and what others like George Abisab and Mohammed Bidjawi would call building on a global south-led reading of international law that seeks to discursively overcome these limitations. In reality, we will only respect and recognize the legitimacy of these laws on the premises of that different reading of international law. And here becomes the very endless question, of course, of Audre Lorde, of whether or not we can use the master's tools. But in reality, here we're not using the master's tools, but rather building on the paradoxes within the master's tools that are built on this idea of justice, and then, of course, seek to maintain this liberal world order. So what we do with that is that we actually seek to engage as scholars, as international lawyers, with that internal paradox, and always point to the fact that actually you cannot build an international legal order without the premises of equality, without non-domination and non-subjugation. And here I find that the sources of the writers from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which is a very short window in the history of international law where there was very strong engagement by scholars of the global south in that ethos and that reading of international law, and but these are sources, and these sources have been validated by the International Court of Justice, and no international lawyer can tell me that this is not an equally international law. So by building on documents like the Declaration of Friendly Relations, Declaration of Ending All Forms of Colonization, by going to the United Nations and asking for an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice, which came 57 years after the start of the occupation. So that's, you can see how long it took the system to call things by what they are. And all that they told us is, oh, yes, this is an illegal occupation. But indeed, if we read what the International Court of Justice said in July 2024 in the advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we will actually find that the court is describing a classic case of colonization. What is a state that commits apartheid, and apartheid, which includes systematic racial segregation within the law, as well as annexation, as well as denial of self-determination, as well as an endless list of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, you name it, Israel has done it. And yet, the International Court of Justice did not call things by their name. It called it an illegal occupation. However, no one can now deny that even by the rule of the highest court of the world, any Israeli foot inside of Gaza or the West Bank is inherently illegal. Palestinians have a legally recognized right of return even to historic Palestine and within what we now call Israel. And Palestinians have the right of reparations. The states have the duty to do everything within their capacity to stop the ongoing plausible genocide, and indeed to cooperate towards ending the illegal Israeli occupation. So these are all now strategic tools for us to use. It is as if that the system has reached a point where it can no longer uphold logic without listening. And this is exactly the moment when the global north has given up on international law. Only last week did the US Congress decide to give zero budget to the United Nations and dismantling of the International Criminal Court as we see it. It's as if the system could not really handle such a paradox or such a shock, even though it's still very minimal. It doesn't even aspire to reach the level of suffering that we are talking, and indeed about, not just in the context of Palestine, but in the context of Sudan, the Congo, you name it, it is happening there as well. And so at this case, in this case, perhaps the question always happen. The question that we go back to isn't the question of what will international law do to Palestine, but rather what is Palestine doing to international law. So we are very steadfast in maintaining not only our advocacy for Palestine, but rather actually our advocacy and leading on using the case of Palestine as a clear case of justice without black or white to reignite or build the premises for a global south reading of international law, a reading that is directly premised on equality, non-domination, and non-subjugation. So as we advocate for that reading of international law, that's the only way that we could hold true to the cause of Palestinian liberation. And indeed, for example, you can see that now the debate on the right to resist, whereby in the liberal spaces of international law, the right to resist is something that we do not speak of. However, we can indeed find very strong General Assembly resolutions that reiterate the right to resist by all means available over and over and over again. Even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that we need to protect human rights lest people rebel again and ask for their rights in their own hands. So By pointing out to these contradictions, the system itself is collapsing. We do not know if this will lead to Palestinian liberation indeed. However, we would like to think of this as one front, let's say, of legal liberation project, more understood more broadly. The strategy here is not short term, but rather very much long term, because the beast that we are met with is indeed unfathomable and quite big. And the vision that we have has to be, by its nature, rather idealistic and a vision of that of dreamers, rather than falling into the real politique that asks us to give up a part of this idealism or that perception of the law.
Shahd spoke of one of these paradoxes, which is the Hague Group, a group of nations from the global south who have come together to protect and uphold the rulings of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court on the Gaza genocide and Israeli apartheid.
So the Hague Group is a group of states that came together from the global south, including Malaysia, Colombia, Cuba, to come together with a declaration in order to uphold international law. So here we can see the ultimate paradoxes of international law, in the sense that states are coming together only to say that we seek to uphold international law as is. So these states came together with a public declaration in support of Palestine, which in the current geopolitical context is a big gamble, since any state that speaks out in support of Palestine, for example, South Africa, which is in the Hague Group, has seen a lot of economic repercussions by imperial powers. So the initiative of the Hague Group seeks to first unify the voice and the strategy of these states in order to counteract the force of imperial powers, but also as a shared initiative of humanity towards the Palestinian people. The states have also made commitments towards not selling and not buying weapons from Israel, so an arms embargo. And they're also seeking to support the Palestinian cause and community in different ways. What we are facing with the Hague Group is limitations of diplomatic capacity, the usual spaces of that, as well as the limitation of the Palestinian representation, being the Palestinian Authority, which, for those who do not know, does not represent the Palestinian people. It's a classic neo-colonial power that puts the Palestinians in a paradox. So, in general, there's a lot of limitations on engaging with Palestine on diplomatic level, either that's prompted either by the Palestinian Authority itself or by the norms of global diplomatic relations. However, what we are hoping to see is more states joining the Hague Group, because the more states are there, the more we're able to unify voices, and the states within the Hague Group are able to better protect themselves from the repercussions that they would face. As we face the tumbling down of international law, perhaps now what we could see and start to build are the building blocks of what is to come in the future. And how is it that we are able to build the premises for a new international order? So, initiatives like the Hague Group that seek to unify state voices and uphold some level of a reading of international law that refuses mass atrocity is indeed the way forward. Furthermore, it is a global south led initiative, which we would like to see way much more of. The global south is the global majority, and sadly enough, for generations, governments have not been representative of their people thanks to imperial powers. So now, with the rise of a few governments that have some representative capacity, though very little, we can hope to see some unification and some strength. Historically speaking, there was the non-aligned movement, for example. There was the Bandung Conference. There were spaces where states of the global south sought to come with each other and enshrine some premises of equality in their approach to international legal order. So, as for what you could do, I highly encourage you to start writing to your MPs and asking them, that is your parliamentary members, and encouraging them to ask their government, why are you not joining the Hague Group? Especially that the Hague Group is such a small basic ask in comparison to how far state international obligations are in according to international law. An arms embargo isn't just something that a state chooses to do. It is an international legal obligation. It's an erga omnes legal obligation premised on the violation of the highest rules of international law. So actually, in this case, joining the Hague Group becomes a move towards upholding some level of an international legal order, and it becomes a move towards that if they want to do that, and if they want to maintain that level of discourse. So we still are very much encouraging people to join and encouraging people to learn more about the Hague Group, and those in the Hague Group to lobby their states to take on more commitments as far as they can. And especially if you're in small states that we still haven't reached, we really need as many voices as possible, keeping that on your agendas when you protest and when you communicate with state officials.
That wraps up our video summary of the second session. If you'd like to see a written summary, including resources and links, then do check out our website, Fractures series page at the link on your page. If you found this series useful in any way, please do consider making a donation. Putting these events together costs a lot of money, and so if you value our work and can support us, please do.